In this session we're going to look at standard costing. So we'll look at what standard costing is and its uses, we'll look at how it's calculated and presented, we'll then consider the different standards that could be used when coming up with our standard costs, and finally we'll consider it in the light of flexed budgets. So what is standard costing? Well, it's where we work out an amount of resources that's required to produce one unit of a product, and we'll also consider the costs associated with those resources. Now, when we think about our resources, we're talking about materials, labour, any direct expenses or indirect expenses. So we think about what is required to produce one unit. So why are these standard costs useful? Well, first of all, they help us with planning, because if we know the standard quantity of resources and the costs associated with one unit, we can scale that up to work out what the cost and the resources that are going to be required for our expected levels of production. It also helps us with control, because we know how much things should cost, we know how much resource should be required for a given level of production. We can then compare what actually happens against our expectations, our standards, and that's going to help us identify where we need to take action to correct things. And finally, it's going to help us make decisions, because we can more easily and more quickly identify the likely results of any decisions that we take, because we can consider their effects on output levels as well as our standards. Let's have a look at a quick example. So a standard cost card, this is something that records the standard costs of inputs, whatever they are, for each product that's made. So up on the screen at the moment I've got a simple example showing the standard cost card for a product P5. So we'll record the materials that are required in terms of quantity of materials, the standard rate being the rate per kilogram of material, or whatever other quantities our materials, labour and overheads are being recorded in, and then we can calculate the total cost of that resource in our cost card. So for materials it's 4 kilograms at £25 per kilogram, a total of £100. We do the same for labour and overheads, and that enables us to calculate the cost per unit. Now in practice we'd have a much more detailed cost card, so we wouldn't just have a single line for materials, we'd have lines for each different type of material. So how do we calculate these standard costs? Well, it does depend on the method of costing that's used by the organisation, whether it's absorption costing, marginal costing, or any other types of costing methods such as activity-based costing. Now when we're looking at absorption costing, remember that our standard costs will also include our direct cost and an element of fixed production cost as well. For marginal costing, here our standard cost will focus only on variable costs, and fixed overhead costs will not be included in our standard cost for any given product. So how can we use standard costing to calculate the total cost of a given level of production? Well, it's very straightforward. We would take our cost card for a single unit. So up on the screen I've got a particular product, and we'll record the various different types of inputs or resources required and their costs, and that gives me a standard cost per unit. If I then wanted to calculate the cost of making 500 units, I would simply take that standard cost per unit of £83 and multiply it by the number of units that I'm looking at. and that gives me a standard cost of £41,500. So standard costing is a very quick way of establishing how much things should cost for a given level of production. We can also use standard costs to monitor our performance, whether or not we're spending too much or perhaps using our resources inefficiently. And if we're going to do this, then we'll follow a particular process. First of all, we'll set the standards. So we'll work out what our standard costs and standard resources are. Secondly, we'll calculate the variances regularly, so we'll compare those standard costs to what actually happens. Thirdly, we'll explain why these variances have occurred, because there will be reasons. Fourthly, we'll then report those variances to the management, and we might make suggestions as to what can be done to either repeat favourable variances or eliminate adverse variances. And finally, we'll take action to make sure that the future is better than what's happened in the past. So let's have a look at how we go about setting our standards in the first place. Well, what we have to do is we've got to consider what resources are needed to make a particular product or provide a service. So we'll think about the materials required. We'll think about the labour that's required. But where do we get that information from in order to determine how much materials cost or how much materials will be required? Well, we can obtain this information by looking at our production plans, by looking at our production records as to how much is produced, and also we might think about work studies to determine what's the most efficient way of making a product or providing a service. Then in terms of the costs, well, we can think about our current labour agreements with employees, as well as agreements with suppliers, and obtain quotes, price lists. It's all fairly obvious stuff. Now, when we're preparing our standards, we've got to decide on the type of standard that we're going to use. So for instance, if the current average time to make a product is 3 hours, and our best employees take 2.5 hours to make a product, and we're expecting to replace machinery that is going to shorten our average times to 2 3/4 hours, what time should we use? So we've got to make a decision about this. Now, when we think about types of standards, there are 4 main types. There are ideal standards, attainable standards, current standards, and basic standards. And we'll define and explain what each of these different types are. We'll start with ideal standards. Well, ideal standards, as the name implies, it assumes ideal conditions. So we're making the assumption that we're not going to have any wastage or inefficiencies in our production process. Problem with this is that it can end up causing us problems with planning, because how much material should be ordered? Should we order the amount that our standard said should be used? But we might end up ordering too little materials, say, because we're assuming that there's going to be no efficiencies. It also affects our control, because adverse variances would be the norm, because we're making the assumption that everything will go really well. So that could affect our staff motivation. We then have attainable standards. Well, these types of standards do assume that wastage and efficiencies will occur, but they're at a level at which would be achievable if our performance was good. So we would expect to see favourable as well as adverse variances, and it can be argued that this is more motivational than ideal standards because staff do see that it's possible to achieve it. Our next type of standard is the current standard. This is just calculated on the basis of current working conditions. So what's happening at the moment, current wastage and efficiency rates, and we then simply assume that those will continue into the future. It is quite practical, but it doesn't end up driving improvement in performance because we're simply saying that the current level of performance is acceptable. But it is easy to calculate. Finally, we have our basic standards. Now these are set on our original basis, so the ones that we calculated when the product was first produced. The problem with these is that they're likely to be out of date. They won't take into account significant changes that may have occurred in terms of the cost of resources, nor in terms of the quantity of resources that are likely to be used. So we end up with large variances, but those large variances might not give us meaningful information because managers will simply say, but the performance targets that are being set are unrealistic because they're based on such old information. So basic standards really shouldn't be used at all, but in practice we do see them still used occasionally. Now we'll consider when we should revise our standards. Well, we should do so when there's been a long-term or permanent change in either the quantity of resources required to produce a single unit or the price of those resources. So don't change them for short-term fluctuations. If it's the case that you expect that a change is going to occur, perhaps a planned pay increase, for example, and that's going to take effect in the period for which we're planning, then take that into account. Although, of course, if we're using current or basic standards, we'd ignore such changes. Finally, let's consider standard costing in the light of flexed budgets. Finally, I'm just going to make one or two points as regards variances when we're using standard costing and variances which are calculated from a flexed budget. As we've said before, if we use standard costing, it does make it easy to calculate costs at different levels of production. And it also enables us to look at variances in great detail and break them down into their constituent parts. This then enhances the control that we have over the organisation because we're able to identify in great detail where things went wrong. We can then investigate and take action as necessary. This is not the case this is not the same with variances calculated from flexed budgets, because here we tend not to calculate our variances in as great a detail. But there is a problem with calculating variances using standard costings, and this relates to how we deal with fixed costs. Because with a standard cost card that includes an element of our overheads or fixed costs, then we're dealing with them as if they are a per unit cost. And this is perhaps unrealistic because the whole point of a fixed cost is that it does not change according to levels of output. So here, a flexed budget which would recognise this cost behaviour is perhaps more realistic, and because it treats them as being unaffected by changes in output. So that is the end of my little session on standard costing.